Hey, I'm Chris, and welcome to episode 5 of the Reunion Church podcast. This is Sunday Recaps, where we discuss a couple key points from the previous service for those that missed it, discussing how it may help you out live your faith. And actually, this week, we're going to have Andrew kind of switch roles here. We're going to have myself interviewed by Andrew since I was the one that taught. Andrew, do you want to kind of explain what the switch up was, what was going on?
Yeah. So this week, I had a few other meetings to kind of run to for kind of launching the church and stuff. And so Chris took over and led through our discussion, which was really cool. Heard some really good feedback, primarily from my wife, because she was the only one I had time to kind of talk to about so far and stuff. But yeah, so I get to ask all the juicy questions. Like, is that Mother Mary in the background you got on a picture frame back there?
Yeah, that's for our cussing and swearing video. Thanks for pointing that out, Andrew.
Oh,
I have
great.
a list of keywords for that video coming up, so check that out on the
On
YouTube
Mary?
channel and all of our socials.
All right.
It was research. It's a whiteboard, actually. I just can't show it yet. It's a surprise. But yeah, we do have our cussing and swearing video. Some people voted on our Instagram and Facebook for what we wanted to do a topic on next. So check that out next weekend. So that should be good.
Got to be spicy. So
yes.
Awesome. Well, yeah, Chris. So we've been going through the Sensing Jesus, ordinary life, ordinary living. We were talking a lot about work, and you continued on that. And I guess kind of recap, like, man, what did you kind of talk about around like work, the purpose of work? Like, what is that?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, the discussion was really good. This last Sunday, given that it's 4th of July weekend, everyone's out vacationing. Even at our job, there were a lot of people out on vacation, which made things even more difficult at work. But just in general, a lot of people were out. So it's kind of a low-key, smaller group that night yesterday. And it was a really good discussion. I think it was actually, we kind of benefited from that, having less people there, because we had a longer conversation on what it means to work and the purpose of work. And we looked at verses in First Thessalonians, we looked at verses in First Timothy, and we really just keyed in on that. I believe it was First Timothy 2, 1-7, off the top of my head. And just what that, like, why do we even work in the first place? We talked about, what's the purpose of work? And then compared it with the way the world sees work and the value that they see in it. And I think the contrast that we kind of came up with for the purpose of work was that essentially, in the Garden of Eden, going back the way that Zach Swine does in his book, Sensing Jesus, work there had a very spiritual significance. There's it's not just what you physically do at your job, but it's also what God's called you to. Everyone's been called by God to do something in some sort of work, but it's not always the same thing, and it's based on our giftings. It's based on where we're based locally. That was something that was brought up that was key that I never thought of before, that I think Ross actually brought up, that, depending on where God places you, the type of work required of you is going to shift and change. Like the idea that like older generations, like the boomer generation, of like, you're going to stick to this job and you're going to do this job forever because that's who you are. You are a mechanic. You're going to be a mechanic for 50 years. That's your legacy. That's who you are. And all of your worth is derived from that purpose of you being a mechanic, sort of thing. And that's kind of like
company.
Yeah. And it's kind of like, that's not really what God's called us to necessarily. Like, yes, Adam was called to garden and to take care of the Garden of Eden, but really his job was to cultivate God's creativity. It was really to, in whatever he did, give glory to God in whatever type of work, whatever type of endeavor. And with our jobs, we just kind of had a great conversation about that, that the purpose of work is not just what you do, but it's why you do it. It's looking for those God moments, is what we kind of called it. So it was really good.
So what are those God moments? Like, what does that look like inside of work itself?
Yeah. So The God moments idea actually came from one of my mentors, Shannon, in high school. He had this crazy claim that every single day, whether you're at work or you're at school or as you go about your day, there's about 10 God moments that happen throughout the day. And it's kind of like an arbitrary number in my mind because I'm like, how did you come up with that number? That doesn't make sense. There's no verse, there's no scripture, there's like, and it
Not
frustrated me
even a
so much.
pinnacle figure.
Yeah, I was like, "Well, are you just throwing that out to like bother me?" Like, and he probably did. He just picked a number, I bet. But
Right.
the idea that there's so many moments where God is doing something extraordinary in the ordinary. So for instance, with the story of Ruth, when she meets Boaz, it's not an extraordinary moment necessarily. It's pretty ordinary. She's essentially jobless, right? She's scavenging for food for her family-in-law. It's the middle of the day, middle of the workday, probably not having a good time. As that chapter kind of goes into detail, she's kind of being harassed at work. Not exactly the ideal circumstances to have your prince, your charming prince show up and talk to you. She was probably not looking her best, acting her best in the best situation to meet the man who would be her husband, Boaz. And yet God took that ordinary moment and made it extraordinary of like, no, I'm going to take this person who was essentially lost everything and graft them into the family of God, the Davidic line, as a lot of us call it, which is just the family of David, the family of Abraham, Isaac, that led up to Jesus, and do something extraordinary here that's not expected. So essentially, those God moments are the extraordinary in the ordinary. So, for instance, one example that was brought up was when I was a contractor, and my boss Mike mentioned right before the day started, we were getting in the truck, loading all the tools, and we were heading out to do one of our appliance installation jobs. And he just mentioned to me, like, as a believer, hey man, I want you to keep me more accountable. I want to be more vocal about my faith, even though it's not really um, necessary for the type of job we do, right? We just install things, we just fix things. We don't really talk to our customers that much.
Yeah.
But I feel convicted this morning to just talk more about my faith. I was like, cool, man, that makes sense. Totally. And then literally the next stop we go to was this older lady. She's like 80, 85, retired. She's not working. She lives alone in this little cottage, um, you know, kind of in a remote area too. So there's no one around her, literally. Like she's just out in the middle of nowhere in Colorado. And as we're doing this quick install for her appliance, her washer and dryer, she had this like stack of books on the table. And on that table, there was a whole bunch of books that all kind of had a similar theme of the end of life. And there's a Bible on top of them. And every book was kind of related to how to end your life, essentially. So I brought up, like, hey, what's this pile of books for? And she kind of just pauses for a second and is like, I have terminal cancer and I don't know how to end my life. And I'm learning about it. And I'm very afraid, very scared. And Mike and I kind of looked at each other like, wow, like it's only like 8 a.m. This is, a huge thing to like come across. But we both recognized in that moment without even saying anything, like, this is an extraordinary moment that God's put in our hands to do something, to comfort this, older lady who is alone. And
And
she
it
kind
would
of
have been
shared
pretty
how she
easy.
has no family anymore. She's kind of the
Yeah.
last of her family. And we got to pray for her. And what should have been like what was a 5-minute fix, because, older people have more difficulty with stuff like that. So they hire people like us, turned into like 30, 40-minute just prayer and talking to this lady and just comforting her of like, well, you're not alone. The God of all comfort is with you. And even though you're going through this difficult, season, there's still hope. God's still with you through the bad and the good and the ugly. And this is just an ugly moment in your chapter in your life. So
And that would have been a pretty easy moment for you guys to essentially almost, oh, hey, yeah, we'll pray for you. And then not
yeah,
actually pray with them in person, but to take that moment and actually use that actual moment, right?
yeah,
And that's what from First Timothy 2:17, like the purpose of work, like the redeeming factor of work itself, like that's what work is really about. is finding those little moments and actually kind of going for them. Is that?
Yeah, essentially, like it, it was, I think one thing we came across too in our discussion is that these moments aren't planned. You can't plan these moments that these God moments that we find ourselves in sometimes. They're just, it feels like they're accidental. Like we didn't ask this lady to be that vulnerable. We didn't ask for us to have that be the first stop after we had a conversation like that. Like the way that God lines things up sometimes is so specific that only he could line up a situation where no, this is a God moment. And sometimes it's like he's announcing the God moment with a megaphone because we miss so many of them. We miss so many moments. Like just imagine if I didn't say anything, about those pile of books, because that was a vulnerable thing to ask of like, yeah, it's not really our business necessarily, but that was one of the few moments where I actually noticed like I need to ask her about this, and our group just kind of came to the conclusion like, yeah, there's a lot of moments that we miss out on, these extraordinary moments that we're always praying about, but we're not paying attention when they actually happen.
Yeah.
And it's always during something ordinary. It's not being called by the president, and it's not going to a foreign land and living years and years with the locals and, saving a whole tribe. It's doing your day-to-day work, you know. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So
When you mentioned Ruth, right, and Boaz, and I know you guys had kind of talked about the idea of romantic realism, right? And the idea of being a hero and what hero work looks like and stuff, right? Um, and I think sometimes there's kind of this idea of hero work of either if you're a Christian, if you got to Bible college, you have the holy work,
yeah,
right? That you have to be full-time pastor, or if you're not, if that doesn't appeal to you whatsoever, you have the hero work itself, like the dream job, the work that everyone wants to do. Like, when you're younger, everyone wants to be a firefighter, or it was a cop. It's probably not a cop anymore. Not a whole lot of people.
maybe.
I think there's a few, but
Yeah,
unfortunately, but yeah, you have kind of those hero jobs that
right.
everyone wants to be, or everyone wants to go into that career field of being a teacher or being a doctor, being a lawyer, all those
Yeah.
things, right? Um, but what is this idea of romantic realism, right? And being and sitting in that, and like those two fields of thoughts that usually Christians kind of struggle with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to kind of break it down simply, the Book of Ruth is the romantic realist book. Like, on the one hand, every women's conference and everything basically women's ministry related has something to do with either Esther or the Book of Ruth. Like, everyone recognizes it's one of the most romantic stories in the entire Bible. And at the same time,
But it's not that romantic, right? Like when you,
yeah, like
it's
when you really think
pretty
about it, it's
ordinary. It's
yeah, it's like nothing. A girl falls in love with a guy,
an old guy
and that's yeah, an old guy, and that's
at
it.
his peak.
Like there's like God's barely mentioned in the book. When he is, he's not put in a good light because the one talking about God is the mother-in-law who's just bitter and angry. Like, and we all have people in our lives like that. Like, the only time that God's mentioned is when they're bitter and angry. And it's a very real book, but it also has this romantic edge to it where it's like
She
it's
sleeps
it's
at his
it's this
feet.
weird yeah, it's this weird balance of
Right.
like both, incredibly romantic and then incredibly realistic. But like, no, actually, this is a great example of a book in the Bible where not everybody's a fan of God, not everybody's a fan of Ruth. And there's so many things going on in the Book of Ruth. Like, there's the racial tension that I picked on recently within the book, where Ruth and her family are from a foreign land, and when they get here, there's kind of this discrimination of, well, you can't have a real job, you have to work in the fields with the other men, right? And it's
Yeah.
not really a good line of work for someone in her position, especially in that culture. It wasn't very honorable to work like that. And it's actually why Ruth kind of hid when Boaz showed up, because it's kind of shameful to like, oh, here's the guy that owns this whole mansion, and now I think I'm in trouble because he's talking to me, and it's so shameful and dishonorable, and in a shame-filled society, that was one aspect to Ruth as well, that came up in the discussion of
But
that
while all
racial
that was
tension.
going on during that time, it's the judges, right? And you got all these
Yeah,
big heroes at the same time.
right.
But what did
And
they like?
well, and what's fascinating too is we brought up how the book of Judges actually used to have the book of Ruth as the ending until the Council of Hippo around 397 AD. So essentially, for like 400 years, Judges was actually ended by the book of Ruth as one of the heroes of the story. And then they kind of recognized that Ruth is kind of its own thing and split them. So during that time of Judges, you have like Samson, you have Gideon, you have all these people that are like Bible story heroes that you hear about in children's ministry or just growing up in the church. And then the book ends with Ruth, like the most mundane story of all of them. Like the same book in the Bible that has this woman just chuck a freaking rock down a tower to kill a king. And then you have this guy who crushes two pillars, an entire city collapses. I don't know if it's a city, but an entire Colosseum essentially collapses with Samson, or Gideon, where he just fights like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people, and just like it's like 300 in the Bible. And then to end with Ruth is like the most like odd ending for a book like Judges, of like there's all these action heroes, there's all this stuff going on, there's all this, all these people who they had songs written about them, um and then with Ruth it's like, nope, it's girl meets boy. And that's the story, like that's it,
Right. But that's
but
the one
there's
that
something
continues.
genuine about it.
Like, yeah. And that's the one that God like continues on, is what you were saying. Like that's the one that, oh no, this one actually matters because
Yeah,
like this one actually helped the redemptive story. All the other ones,
yeah,
yeah. And it's this weird idea, like you're talking about that heroism complex itself that we kind of
yeah.
get lost in, right? Is
Oh
that
yeah, yeah. And we're prone to heroism that's not like the book of Ruth. We're kind of prone to this idea that I'm the hero and I can solve and fix all of my problems, and I'm meant to. And we're told that through media, through social media, movies, TV, everything. People in our lives, like, you know, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And funny enough, I was listening to a podcast where that was actually an ironic statement used against, people during the slave era in American history, because it's literally impossible to pull someone up by their bootstraps.
yeah,
So it's kind of like an irony that we say that when the original meaning of the word was derogatory towards those who couldn't pull themselves out of a lower income situation, or even less than lower income given the slavery situation. So it's like that, like even these like this American mythology we have around being the hero of your own story, being the hero of your own life, is just not true. Like if anything, we're a lot like Ruth, where we're kind of a side character. Like really, the book of Ruth is about God redeeming people from a plague and a pandemic, and then a drought that happens, and then all the men in the family die, and then they go to a foreign land, get racially discriminated against. They're a lower income household, and they're just trying to, figure things out. It's like the book that no one reads, but it's the most relatable right now, given what's happened in the world in the last couple of years.
yeah,
And it's so weird that God, even though he's not mentioned as much in the book of Ruth, he's really the main character. And Ruth is just along for the journey because she's not really as active in like kind of like these God moments. We're not really actively seeking them out. Like Ruth wasn't asking for Boaz to show up and talk to her. She was probably bitter that her first husband died. She was probably bitter that they tried to have children and couldn't because of what happened previously. There's probably a lot of shame and bitterness from that. And then God has this moment of, no, I'm gonna redeem and restore and reunite you to myself and to the mission that I've called you to. So really, the hero's journey is the side quest character's journey. That's how we should look at it, because God's the main character. He's the one that does great things.